Hello, everyone. Today we're going to cover Chapter 10, Psychosocial Development in Early Childhood. I've broken this lecture into 4 parts, and the first part that we'll cover right now is the foundations of this important set of skills. So what exactly develops in early childhood when it comes to psychosocial development? Well, the first thing is the ability to regulate one's feelings, which we refer to as emotional regulation. This is a key developmental period for the developing child's ability to identify how he or she is feeling and manage strong emotions, both positive and negative. Now, we will do a complete section on the development of emotion regulation a little bit later in part 3. But for now, I'd like you to keep in mind that emotional regulation develops as so many things in child development occur. It's a combination of biological readiness and experience in the environment. So children learn how to manage their feelings through their social interactions with others, particularly their parents or other adults who will help to regulate the child through just natural responsiveness to where the child is emotionally. Now, as we'll cover more in part 3, the young child's ability to regulate strong feelings becomes a pretty important predictor of their functioning as an adult. Early emotion regulation skills have been shown to be strongly associated with later academic achievement and success in one's career. So a second important capacity that develops in early childhood is what we call self-concept. This is the set of ideas that we each develop or generate about ourselves, along with our ideas about what we are capable of, what our strengths are, and what our limits are. So Erik Erikson was very important in guiding our thinking about this important developmental capacity because he basically suggested that early childhood is the period of tension between initiative and guilt. Initiative meaning you pull your resources in order to address the challenge in front of you. Guilt is that feeling of missing an opportunity, that you were too passive and you didn't have enough confidence in your abilities to try to attempt the challenge. So to Erikson, the preschooler's developmental task is to come up with a realistic idea of his or her own abilities and strengths. Younger children tend to be overly confident about their abilities, and the early childhood period, particularly as young children are around other similarly aged peers, their self-concept can be kind of changed and sometimes even stepped on by experience when they start to recognize that some of their playmates are actually better skilled than they are in certain domains. So to Erikson, developing this self-concept is a really important developmental task of the ages of 3 to 5. Now, a third capacity that develops remarkably during early childhood is what we call executive function skills, or if you're coming from a more temperament-informed sort of perspective, you may refer to it as effortful control. So executive function, as you may recall, emphasizes the cognitive components of regulation. So it has a lot to do with that maturity of the prefrontal cortex, and it's basically very engaged in the coordinating and regulating of attention, and then throughout the preschool period, more and more regulating emotions with those cognitive elements of attention, and then regulating the behaviors that are a consequence of that interaction. Now, as I mentioned, you'll see the term effortful control sometimes in places where others would say executive function. And I just wanted to point out that effortful control is a bit of a more nuanced way of thinking about executive functioning. It refers specifically to a child's ability, which develops in early childhood, to regulate emotion, such as managing frustration, and then to be able to intentionally engage the attentional systems when they're needed. So these are the years when a child learns to persist when they're challenged. They can basically motivate themselves to get through a difficult task because they have this developmental capacity bringing their social, emotional, cognitive, and then all of those coordinating and regulating functions all together. So the development of executive functioning or effortful control is a really important part of early childhood. Now, as I mentioned, Erickson describes this developmental trajectory as a resolution of a very specific psychosocial crisis, and that is initiative versus guilt. As children take on more and more skills and activities and gain a sense of confidence, they seem to then experience less frustration, difficulty, and greater persistence in challenge. So, Erickson's ideas about initiative versus guilt are really an early precursor to how we think about effortful control as one of the most important growing capacities in early childhood. One of the side effects, you might say, of experiencing this constant tension between I don't know if I can do it, should I try, can I do it, is what psychologists call protective optimism. This is something you often will hear from preschoolers, and it can be a quite refreshing state of mind if you're used to interacting with adults all the time. Protective optimism is the idea that most young children hold very positive ideas about themselves. Most of them have what we would call a positivity bias, that beginning at about age 3, they see themselves as capable of just about anything. And that protective optimism can be what helps them tackle a challenge that previously seemed too overwhelming or difficult to bear. So Erickson describes it as a crisis, and contemporary psychologists talk about it as identifying a resource that the young child can pull on when they need to tackle a challenge of any kind. In fact, between the ages of 3 and 5 years, we see children developing stronger and stronger types of specific motivations, which will be useful to them as they navigate life. So up until the age of 3, primarily children are motivated extrinsically, meaning that there's a drive or a reason to pursue a goal, perhaps doesn't have to be conscious, but that if you can complete this skill or task, there's an outside reward. Maybe it's a parent's attention, maybe it's more time with a toy, that sort of thing. In the preschool years, the developing child can learn to differentiate and actually have a drive or a reason to pursue a goal that comes from inside themselves, doesn't require an outside reward or another person giving more attention or more comfort. Intrinsic motivation emerges in early childhood and helps a child to rely on his or her own self-talk, own resources to get through a challenge. In fact, one of the ways that you can actually observe intrinsic motivation developing in a child is when they invent an imaginary friend. And this is because that particular activity is not extrinsically reinforced usually, and is thought to be motivated purely by a desire to connect and understand the world by playing with one's own internal representations of it. All of those things being strongly tied to intrinsic motivation. So how does all of this development happen in early childhood? Well, as I mentioned in the beginning, we'll talk about this some more. Parents and the environment will definitely play a part, but there's also a certain amount of biological readiness that needs to be in place in order for children to learn these complex skills. So in the early childhood period, the brain continues to grow in a very specific way. The prefrontal cortex, remember that part of the frontal lobes that helps you with executive function and effortful control, well, that's going to continue to grow, and pretty substantially, between the ages of 3.5 to 5 years. Thus, we see improvements in the efficiency of the coordinating and regulating systems as they become more and more online. Now, a second important neurological change that occurs is that the limbic system, which is the part of your brain that manages emotions, the myelination in that system, you may recall myelination is the insulation in a way, wrapping those nerve fibers in a sort of gelatinous material that will enable the signals to travel more quickly, more efficiently. So as the emotional system gets, in a sense, better connected up with the higher reasoning sections of the brain, such as the prefrontal cortex and the decision-making parts of your higher cortex. As the myelination improves, the connectivity improves. While the prefrontal cortex is getting more complex, the limbic system, your emotions, are now more closely tied to those structures, and we see improvements in emotional regulation and executive functioning, primarily because of the neurological infrastructure that really grows during this time. So as this brain maturation happens, we see young children develop longer attention spans. We see them, the brain becomes increasingly plastic as more and more connections are created and refined. So we also see improvements in flexible thinking and in imagination. There's an increase in the child's perception of what she can do for herself, and there's also improvements in the ability to inhibit or put the brakes on, stop oneself when maybe you want something that you can't have. So increasingly, children are able to do what's called delay gratification, meaning gratification is satisfaction, giving you something you want. Delaying gratification, young children can learn to wait longer and longer for something they really want. You may remember from your textbook, they cover the Marshmallow Task, where they leave a child alone in a lab room. Adult puts one marshmallow in front of the child and says, I'm going to leave this here. If you don't eat that marshmallow until I come back, which will be in 2 minutes, then I'll give you a second one. If you decide to eat it, you don't get a second one. The adult then leaves the room, and they study how long it takes children of different ages to how long can they wait, what do they do while they're waiting, and basically what we see is that self-control, the ability to delay gratification, improves from about the age of 3.5 to 5. And children will differ temperamentally on how much waiting they can do, but usually that capacity develops and improves over time. And lastly, it's important to remember that while brain maturation contributes to increases in social awareness and self-concept, we also have the ongoing social influences around the child that will enable these brain changes to result in functional improvements as the child grows towards being ready for kindergarten. So with that, I'm going to stop with part 1 on foundations of psychosocial development in early childhood, and I'll turn to our next section, which will be on play. Thank you.